Okay, in this lesson we will look at the impact, the aims, the impact and the success or not of Nazi policies towards women and the family. This phrase, and again, sorry to any German speakers about my mangling of your language, this phrase kind of summarizes the aims in terms of how the Nazis saw the role of women. Kinder, Küche, Kirche, which means children, kitchen, and church. So very much women seen as homemakers, raising and looking after a family. Well, there were two reasons for that. One was, two sort of aims behind Nazi policy. One was connected with this idea of racial purity. So the Nazis wanted a German people of blonde Aryans, so they were keen on racial purity. So that's part of the focus behind what they wanted to do, which was to create a lot of young Germans, basically. So women were sort of almost like baby factories, baby machines that wanted to produce a lot of young Aryan Germans. Partly because since 1900, throughout the turmoil and the Great Depression, the birth rate in Germany had been falling. And in order to populate this great German Reich that Hitler wanted to create, to have workers in the factories and farmers in the fields, etc., as well as soldiers for the army, well, clearly, in order for those things to be achieved, you need to reverse the declining birth rate and basically make lots of babies. So partly ideological, to create a racially pure Germany, and partly practical to increase the birth rate to create German workers and soldiers. So, the ideological, let's explore that a bit more. Well, Hitler himself and other leading Nazis had a very, I guess what you would call traditional, old-fashioned view of the role of the sexes, the role of the genders. They saw a natural distinction. Men were seen as productive and creatives involved in politics and war, and Hitler certainly wasn't keen. He didn't allow any women, for example, to become senior members or any real level of responsibility within the Nazi party. He saw women as not being involved in politics. He saw that as a male role. What was the role, according to Hitler and Nazi ideology? Reproductive, as I said, make babies. Passive, in other words, not to be argumentative, to listen and obey their husbands. Family and home. I'm sorry to any women or girls listening to this. It's slightly annoying, but thankfully the regime doesn't exist, although some of these attitudes still do. Natural occupations, natural, that should be in two inverted commas, sorry about that, were wives and mothers, and women were not seen to be part of the workforce. It very much discouraged women from working. If women were involved in work, things that were seen as female caring roles, nursing or social work. So very much the aim is to get women out of employment and into the home as mothers and homekeepers. Any sort of occupation then that wouldn't endanger childbearing, so no emphasis on any dangerous jobs or strenuous physical jobs. So how successful were the Nazi policies towards women and the family? Well, as with boys, membership of the Hitler Youth became compulsory in 1936, and as we covered in a previous lesson, the League of Young Girls to the League of German Nations, League of Young Girls, sorry, it was the organisation for girls under 14. Once they became 14, they would join the League of German Maidens, did lots of sort of aerobic exercises to become healthy young women as prospective future mothers. 18 to 20, the Faith and Beauty Organisation, although the wearing of makeup, permed hair or high heels was discouraged. And the National Socialist Organisation for Women. So clearly a lot of organisations set up, and partly because of the compulsory nature of some of them, such as the Hitler Youth, very, very large enrolment rates. So in that basic level, it could be seen as successful. And indeed, some girls saw the chance of a career within these organisations and the avoidance of the authority of their parents. So despite the very traditional view, Nazi view, of the role of women, some women, and girls, particularly in rural areas, saw some opportunities there to develop self-confidence and hold some posts of leadership and responsibility. Let's look in a bit more detail at this idea of creating a racially pure society. Here again you can see a piece of Nazi propaganda. with a very protective, paternal-looking man. And how many have we got? We've got 4 children there. In a minute you can work out what medal that woman would win. So, Nazi family policy, as we've already said, worried about the falling birth rate and the racial quality of the population. Some local authorities created incentives for women and, I guess, couples, it does require to have more children by offering rebates on rent, water and electricity. That's basically reductions on your rent, your water and your electricity bill for larger families, again encouraging childbirth. And there was actually a medal. Men in the army could win the Iron Cross for acts of bravery. Well, there was the Mother's Cross too, created in 1938. Gold would for 8 children, silver for 6 and bronze for 4 children. So I guess that would be some sort of symbolic reward for childbearing. It's supposed to be an incentive. There were also more practical monetary incentives as well for couples. The law for the reduction of unemployment. So this is, if you remember, if you've learned about at all, Hjalmar Schacht's battle for work. We'll talk about that more in class, but certainly as part of this battle for work, women were removed from the unemployment registers. What was offered were interest-free loans, up to 10,000 Reichsmarks, and that was quite a significant amount of money. That's money that you could use to help set up a family. But in order to qualify for that loan, young married couples, the wife would have to give up work. So again, it's 2-pronged there. One is the monetary incentive to enable couples to have families, but on the condition that the wife would give up work. Women and the law. Well, in keeping with this idea of women in the more passive homemaking role, women were forbidden from being judges and lawyers, and women in those professions were barred. Divorce laws were also changed for unproductive marriages, so it was very easy to get a divorce if your marriage was childless and it appeared that you would not be able to have children. So divorce in order for the man or the woman to remarry and make babies for the Third Reich. Family policy and repression. Obviously, all of these things have a very dark side to them. So although so-called racially pure women were encouraged to have babies, the policy was not the same for those deemed undesirable. So socialists, pacifists, the Sinti and the Roma, are also called gypsies, although you shouldn't really use that word, it's kind of insulting. The Sinti people and the Roma people were sterilised, and this is not with anyone's permission, this is involuntary sterilisation. Men and women forced onto the operating table. And between 1934 and 1939, 320,000 people were forcibly sterilised. And indeed, 80 men and 400 women died as a result of these forced surgical procedures. Here we can see a very traditional sort of bit of propaganda. We do not stand alone. With again, see the man in the very protective position, holding the shield, and the woman in the sort of more passive role in the middle there. Women and war. Well, this is something of a U-turn that starts to happen now in Nazi policy towards women. In 1937, the economy under the 4-year plan, under Hermann Göring, there is preparation for war. Hitler knows that war is extremely likely in order for him to achieve his foreign policy goals of creating a greater Germany, and particularly Lebensraum in the East is going to need war. And in that case, the economy needs to be up, production needs to be up. And a lot of men now are involved have been conscripted into the army and into the rearmament industries. And there is basically a very big shortfall in labour. Women are basically needed in the workplace to make up for this labour shortage. Well, actually, in your discussion, in your thoughts of just how successful were Nazi policies towards women, although women were forced out of the professions, there were still many, many millions of German women working all the way through the 1930s. So the Nazis were not particularly successful in removing women from the workforce. Very many German women did remain in the workforce. The Nazis now, however, needed even more women in jobs, so they needed to mobilise that productive power of women in factory jobs. The problem for them was, despite all the propaganda, the jobs that were being offered were low-paid factory jobs and were not very effective. Well, some women were persuaded by the propaganda, they did believe in the ideology, and some did take up offers of work. During the Second World War, you can see it wasn't that significant, so a limited degree of success. Over the war years, between 39 and 44, 14.6 million women at the beginning of the war. It's risen a bit by 1944, but certainly in terms of mobilising all of the possible available female labour in the economy, they are much less successful than, for example, countries like Britain, the United States, and particularly the Soviet Union, which managed to mobilise a much greater percentage of their female workforce. So, summary, the natural distinction that's seen between the sexes, the different role of the sexes, Nazi priorities in terms of the family and the role of women as homemakers and childbearers, Nazi family policies, what were their aims, both practical and ideological, how did policy towards women, how was it affected by the war, and overall how successful were Nazi policies towards women and the family. I hope you've made some decent notes, and thanks for watching.